Agent 8 is my favorite Splatoon character. While the idols, the villains, and other NPCs normally take the spotlight, I always find myself wondering about the lives of the playable Inklings and Octolings. I often think about how they interact with this world and how they feel about the conflicts taking place within it. 8 was Nintendo's answer to these questions. While still a silent protagonist, they are easily the most fleshed out of the playable cast, and their story the most fully realized. A large reason for my interest in the character comes from the unique look we are given into their mind. See, 8 never speaks out loud, but we learn their inner thoughts through the Mem Cakes. Mem Cakes were first introduced in Splatoon 2's Octo Expansion, where they could be collected upon completing a test in the Deep Sea Metro. They were described as memories compressed into physical form, and by viewing a Mem Cake in the menu, you could find a poem from 8's perspective about the object or person the cake represented. While many of these were just silly and some a little bland, others provided fascinating insight into 8's perspective on the world around them. Some were hopeful, others were dark, and a few were surprisingly wistful. Around the time of Splatoon 2, we didn't have a great idea of how the Mem Cakes were actually made, but that didn't really matter to me. I was just happy we could learn more about 8. About their perspective, their story of making it to the surface. In collecting the Mem Cakes, both the player and 8 learn about this world and about themselves. It was always my assumption then that by collecting all 80 Mem Cakes across the entire Kamaboko testing facility, we could essentially restore 8's entire memory. Upon reaching the surface, they would have finally remembered everything about their past just as they were ready to step into the future. And that was all well and good until Splatoon 3. Splatoon 3's Side Order DLC brought back 3 of the main characters from Octo Expansion, being Pearl, Marina, and 8, in addition to some of the concepts native to their original story, such as sanitization, Kamaboko, and, you guessed it, Mem Cakes. While most of this information just serves to flesh out the backstory of the Memverse, some of it has forced us to reevaluate what we thought we knew back in 2018. Most of what I'm referring to has to do with sanitization, which I covered in depth in my previous video. However, there are a couple of details I didn't give much attention, and I've seen some confusion and conflicting opinions about what they might mean for the nature of Mem Cakes and, more importantly, Agent 8. So today I wanted to dive into the lore of just the Mem Cakes specifically and share my own interpretation of this new information. Let's talk about it. Before diving right into the new stuff, let's review everything we know from the start. When we first take control of 8 at the beginning of Octo Expansion, we learn that they have amnesia. Cuttlefish infers that this happened when they hit their head falling into the Deep Sea Metro. And something I didn't mention in the previous video is that we can actually see a hole in the ceiling above the place 8 fell. But then we enter the character customization screen, which looks like this. As a couple of comments on my sanitization video pointed out, the sequence of events here isn't super clear. At some point, each of these things happened. Agent 8 was fighting Agent 3, and Cuttlefish was there too. Assuming this isn't just a hallucination or an abstraction for the sake of gameplay, Agent 8 was floating in a green liquid, and Agent 8 fell a large distance, crashed through the ceiling, and hit the floor. How they got from point A to B to C is not really clear. The official Splatoon world map only complicates this further, because somehow the 3 characters were taken all the way from Octo Valley to the bottom of Encadia Bay. This isn't really the mystery I'm setting out to solve today, but it sets the precedent that this stuff doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. Regardless of how exactly it went down, we know 2 things for sure. 8 lost their memory, and throughout Octo Expansion, they get at least some of their memory back. But how did each of these things happen? My current running theory for 8 losing their memory was laid out in the sanitization video. Basically, there are several pieces of evidence that strongly suggest 8 was put through the first step of sanitization. Namely, their memories were removed and turned into Mem Cakes. Again, this isn't explicitly confirmed anywhere, but it would explain and tie together a bunch of lore and side order, and I didn't really see a lot of people disagreeing with me in the comments, so for the rest of this video I will be assuming that this theory is correct. That means our main goal today is to answer the second question. How, and to what extent, did 8 get their memory back? If we're only looking at Octo Expansion, this answer seems obvious. They just collect the Mem Cakes, right? 8 starts out knowing almost nothing about their past life, but the poems are evidence of their memory returning. This seems to be supported by a statement from Yusuke Amano in the Splatoon 2 first anniversary interview. There, he stated, "Agent 8 has amnesia at the start, but when you clear stages in the experimental facility, fragments of their memory will come back, and in the process, the player will become more emotionally involved with Agent 8. The developers even explain how 8 is able to write about characters and objects on the surface that they haven't seen yet. Art director Seita Inoi and producer Hisashi Nogami had this to say. Inoi, the Mem Cakes have poems from the perspective of Agent 8, who is thinking about this magazine called High Karawalker. They look at this magazine and think, this is what it must be like on the surface. Nogami, Mem Cakes are fragments of memories after all, so things that 8 didn't actually see were imprinted in their brain from reading too much High Karawalker. For anyone who doesn't know, High Karawalker, or Ingopolis Illustrated, is both a real-life art book for Octo Expansion and an in-universe magazine that can be seen on the Deep Sea Metro train car. What the developers are saying here is that 8 has canonically looked through this magazine while dreaming of life on the surface, so they're aware of things like Inkopolis shopkeepers, brands, and competitive ink battles. These thoughts about the surface were taken from their mind and turned into Mem Cakes just like their memories of the past. An important takeaway from these quotes is that it's always suggested that the memories and the poems are from 8's perspective. Program director Shintaro Sato and Nogami reaffirm this in the next few lines of the interview. Sato, of course, some of the things about Octarians are based on Agent 8's own experiences. Nogami, incidentally, the reason why the Inklings in the Mem Cakes have a mean look in their eyes is because it's an Inkling from an Octoling's perspective. So, like I said, it made sense at the time of Octo Expansion to assume that by collecting all of the Mem Cakes, we were essentially restoring all of 8's memories, both their reflections on the past and their hopes for the future. The inner Agent 3 fight, by extension, always seemed to me like a final test of 8's commitment. They must overcome their inner self in order to move on from the past and embrace their new life on the surface. Or something like that. Now, Side Order brings this understanding somewhat into question, but the reason I wanted to make this video is because I think some people are taking these lines to the extreme and misinterpreting what the developers are actually intending to do with this new information. Let's go ahead and take a look at Side Order and the new lore we have about 8. First of all, 8 did not re-lose their memory at the start of Side Order. Don't believe every pro-Chara thumbnail you see. Pearl does remind 8 what's going on and mentions their head being fuzzy, but that's probably because 1. Players who started with Splatoon 3 wouldn't know what Pearl and Marina normally look like, and 2. 8 just had their mind transported into a computer for the first time. I really don't think it's worth reading into this line as anything other than a tutorial, and even if you do, it makes sense in-universe that 8 might need a second to get their bearings. They did not forget who Pearl and Marina are. Our first real surprise comes much later, when Marina suggests that 8's memory wasn't fully restored. She says in the dev diary that she made the Memverse to help 8 and the other victims of Kamaboko get their memories back. The entire point of the Memverse was to restore the minds and souls of sanitized Octarians. So once again, this serves as evidence that 8 was probably sanitized, but it also means that collecting the Mem Cakes in Octo Expansion wasn't enough. 8 has to climb the spire and use the program Marina made in order to fully repair the damage done. Unfortunately, Side Order is very, vague on whether or not this actually works. Like, 8 has a palette in the Memverse, which means that part of their soul is stuck in the digital world. So by taking it to the top of the spire, Marina is able to reconfigure the settings and set 8's soul free. But that's kind of not the same thing as restoring their memory. They just throw this line out there in the dev diary without ever giving the mystery of 8's memory a proper conclusion, which is honestly pretty annoying considering how much attention was given to 8's state of mind in Octo Expansion. I really wish I could provide a more solid explanation, but that's pretty much the extent of what we know at the moment. 8's memory is probably fully restored, since that was, again, the entire point of the Memverse, but it's really strange that no one ever comes out and says it. Unfortunately, there's no easy assumption to make about this next line. In entry number 5 of the dev diary, Marina says that she analyzed Mem Cakes from Agent 8 and Cuttlefish. What? What do you mean, Mem Cakes from Cuttlefish? Cuttlefish didn't have any Mem Cakes. There was no sign of him getting sanitized. Cuttlefish didn't even have amnesia. He very clearly displays knowledge of events from hours before the game all the way back to 100 years ago. What do you mean, Mem Cakes from Cuttlefish? The only way I could possibly make sense of this line is that 8 and Cuttlefish were both holding on to 8's Mem Cakes, and they gave them to Marina to study, thus Mem Cakes from 8 and Cuttlefish, but the way this is written makes it very unclear if that's what it's supposed to mean. If that isn't the case, and Marina really means that Cuttlefish had his own Mem Cakes, I really don't know how we're supposed to interpret this. We were told in side order that Mem Cakes are memories that have been physically extracted from someone's mind. Cuttlefish shows no signs of losing his memory, so as far as we know, he can't have Mem Cakes. Even reading the Japanese text doesn't really help, since the dev diaries were actually translated very accurately. What makes this even stranger is the way Commander Tartar treats Captain Cuttlefish. In Octo Expansion, when we assemble the 4 things into the blender, Commander Tartar doesn't stop Cuttlefish from entering alongside 8, despite him not having cleared any tests. Whether or not this is because Tartar saw Cuttlefish as worthy to be a part of the Supreme DNA solution is debatable. 8 is the only one who registers as a test subject, and Tartar only ever addresses 8 as they collect each thing. We were also told by the developers that at the end of the game, Commander Tartar actually holds a great amount of respect for Agent 8. 8 is the most successful test subject it has ever seen, so it holds them in a high regard compared to someone like Cuttlefish, who it refers to as a superfluous nobody. It's almost like it doesn't even perceive Cuttlefish stepping into the blender, either because he isn't registered as a test subject, or because Tartar sees him as some kind of insignificant lesser being. My point in saying all this is that Tartar didn't seem to have any interest in sanitizing or testing Cuttlefish, and there is blatant proof that Cuttlefish did not lose his memory. So again, I wish I had a better answer to give you, but this line goes against so many things we know to be true about the events of Octo Expansion and the process of sanitization, to the point that I'm just gonna kind of ignore it until anyone can make sense of it. Feel free to tell me what you think in the comments, because I seriously have no clue. Your guess is as good as mine. Lastly, I'd like to talk about an idea I've seen going around that I strongly disagree with. This was honestly my entire motivation for making this video, because I think it does damage to the community's understanding of my single favorite element of Splatoon's world: 8. When describing her expedition to Kamaboko to collect and research Mem Cakes, Marina mentions that Commander Tartar stored them in what was essentially a garbage dump. They were left completely unorganized, and it was impossible to know which cakes belonged to which individuals. That makes enough sense on its own, but I've seen some people use this line, along with the reveal that 8's memory is still partially missing, to argue that the Mem Cakes we collect in Octo Expansion don't belong to 8, and are actually just a random assortment of Mem Cakes from other sanitized Octarians. Personally, I think this is a misunderstanding of the developers' intentions. In Octo Expansion, the sole purpose of the Mem Cakes was to characterize 8, as explicitly explained by the developers in the interview I quoted earlier. At the time of Splatoon 2, there was no connection drawn between the cakes and sanitization, and we were told that 8 restored their own memory as they collected them. I think this idea arose because Side Order told us Mem Cakes could only be made through sanitization and did not make it super clear whether or not 8 actually was sanitized. However, keeping in mind the stated intentions of the developers, along with the strong implication that 8 was sanitized and would have produced their own Mem Cakes, I think it makes much more sense to still assume that these are 8's memories we are collecting in Octo Expansion. I already brought up the cakes that are literally said to be produced from 8's dreams about the surface, but there are also a handful of poems about their past that feel too specific to be associated with just a random Octarian's memory. The poem written for an Octoling soldier has 8 recounting a memory of a childhood friend. The poem for DJ Octavio has 8 apologize for dishonorably deserting the army. Many of the poems use I or we, and almost all of them express some kind of opinion on the subject of the memory. Even the cake for something as simple as the Zeko brand has 8 putting aside their fear of the sea for the euphoric feeling of the ocean breeze. What I'm trying to get at here is that the Mem Cakes are just too personal to come from random sanitized subjects. Why would a generic Octoling memory remind 8 of their oldest friend? Why would a random Octocopter cake allow 8 to recall a peaceful hilltop picnic? More often than not, 8 expresses not a simple description of the Mem Cake's appearance, but an associated memory from their life in the underground domes. These sentiments are specific and consistent in their voice. They aren't an amalgam of memories from previous subjects. These are 8's memories. But, I hear you ask, what about that line from the dev diary? If these are all 8's Mem Cakes, doesn't that mean that Commander Tartar did organize them? Well, think about what Marina says here. She found the Mem Cakes in Tartar's garbage dump. Why would Tartar go through the trouble of producing Mem Cakes in the first place if it was just going to instantly turn around and throw them all away? Recall how we actually obtain the Mem Cakes. We are given them as a reward for completing tests. They are an incentive. Tartar knew that memories were the ultimate reward for its amnesiac prisoners, and so it used the Mem Cakes to lure subjects along and play right into its non-existent phone hands. To support this idea, let's look at another quote from that very same developer interview. Yusuke Amano said, "And the reason why you receive Mem Cakes. That's because the test subject will be in trouble when they finally reach the Promised Land." Of course, referencing the fact that Tartar would blend successful subjects. And at that time, the head of the Kamabo Corporation will leave behind proof that the test subject existed in this world, and that comes in the form of Mem Cakes. The interviewer then asked, "Does that mean that there are 10,007 Mem Cakes kept somewhere?" Nogami responded, "I think they're stored somewhere. However, some people have stopped in the middle of it, so the amount is not clear." The interviewer again, "So there are still a lot of test subjects who went to the Promised Land in the past. In that case, do the 4 things get put back again?" Amano, "Yes, they do. They have to be put back every time." There are 2 things that stand out to me from these quotes. First, Commander Tartar would store the Mem Cakes of previous subjects somewhere. And second, if the Thangs had to be returned to their stations after a test subject found them, it's likely that only one subject could be tested at a time. Knowing this, we can put together an educated guess about how the Mem Cakes might have been used. My personal understanding goes something like this. Upon their arrival in the Deep Sea Metro, Commander Tartar would have any potential test subjects put through the first step of sanitization. This would remove their memories and turn them into Mem Cakes. These Mem Cakes would then be distributed throughout the testing facility, with 1 Mem Cake serving as the reward for the test at each station. Subjects would be allowed to claim as many Mem Cakes as they wanted, but their ultimate goal was to collect the 4 Thangs. Some subjects succeeded in collecting the Thangs, in which case they were blended and added to Tartar's supreme DNA solution. At this time, their Mem Cakes would be discarded and thrown in storage. Other subjects, like Isopadre, gave up on testing partway through. Tartar would no longer have need for their Mem Cakes either, so they would be disposed of as well. Basically, there would be 1 set of Mem Cakes placed around Kamaboko at any given time, but once that subject was done testing, they would all be scooped up and thrown into a pile with all the other subjects' cakes, in what Marina calls the garbage dump. In Octo Expansion, upon completing all 80 tests, Sea Cucumber tells us that we are the first subject to ever do this, which means that every other subject, successful or not, would have left behind some uncollected Mem Cakes. Multiply some by 10,007, and yeah, that's a lot of Mem Cakes. A lot of Mem Cakes that Commander Tartar no longer had any use for. This system would explain why 8 was sanitized and lost their memory, why they express personal sentiments or memories for each Mem Cake they collect, why Isopadre is so desperate to see Mem Cakes from anyone at all, and why, years later, Marina finds the cakes in a massive unorganized mess. This understanding preserves the characterization of Agent 8 in Octo Expansion while still keeping true to the lore of both games. Cool. And yeah, that's it. That's all I had for this video. I basically just wanted to make a bit of a follow-up to the sanitization video that dove deeper into one of the more confusing reveals of Side Order. This ended up being a bit more speculative than that video, but I don't think anything I said here goes beyond a level 1 headcanon at most. I really believe this is the best way to interpret the information we've been given, but I'm certainly open to hearing other opinions in the comments. I don't want to necessarily be an authority on Splatoon lore as much as I want these videos to be an avenue for discussion. So go ahead and let me know what you think. Until next time, thanks for watching. This has been Cosmic. Farewell.